Hi everyone. This video I think is an important one. I mean, all my videos I talk about issues which I feel are important and worth talking about. But this one I think encompasses a wide range of subjects. I'm just keeping track of the time as I want to see the announcement of the Conservative leadership contest because of course it means it narrows down to who will be our next Prime Minister. It's either going to be Sunak versus Truss or Sunak versus Morden. There's a small chance, of course. Sunak hasn't got the 120. It might actually be Mordaunt versus Truss, though I think that's unlikely. Okay, so yeah, I'm just keeping track of the time. I want to see that this time. So Graham Brady said it will be 4 o'clock today. Chairman of the 1922 committee. Right, cynicism. Cynicism. Um, Sometimes I look through my videos and I think, are there more negative videos than positive? What I mean by that is, do I cover more critical issues than optimistic issues? Maybe I do. I'm kind of aware of it, and it's not deliberate. It's just that I talk about things I feel need to be talked about. But where I do feel there's something positive, I try and talk about it, and I'll maybe try and do so a bit more because I don't actually think that the world is all bad. Um, and I think that sometimes we can see hyperbole. On crime, for example, now I'm very hardline on crime, but my issue is about sentencing and justice, not necessarily crime levels. The UK is actually quite a safe country with a low homicide rate compared to many parts of the world. But when there's a particularly vicious crime, people say it's getting out of control. It's what's happening. Um, my stance has always been about justice and transparency of justice and sentencing, but I don't believe it's necessarily getting out of control compared to 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Um, the only way you could really gauge that is with data that's available. Um, and I don't think that there's any evidence that we've got more violent as a society necessarily. I think the homicide rate, if it hasn't stayed stable, it's actually went down slightly. Um, but nevertheless, we have problems. When you see these mindless, destructive crimes, um, it is easy to sort of get into a depressive overview and think it's out of control. Because I think, particularly in some areas where you have a serious problem with antisocial behaviour, and there seems to be a breakdown in law and order, where the police are not respected and their law enforcement. And, I'm not saying that there isn't areas of tension with the police, but when there's that breakdown in general, when people are doing terrible things and the police seem powerless to act and things like that, it's that can definitely produce cynicism. I think we have to look at the world context as well. The 2020s has so far been a very turbulent decade. Every decade is on some level, but this one particularly because we've had the biggest pandemic since the 1918 influenza pandemic. Yes, it has cost more lives, but it's over a much longer period of time. So that was something, the coronavirus pandemic, and it still isn't totally over. Let's not forget. It's changed the world. It's affected this world in a way that nothing has in my lifetime. Not the end of the Cold War, not 9/11, not the war on terror, the Arab Spring, the rise of China, all those things, though big. COVID really is the thing that has really affected the world, I would say. Um, and I think, not only the mortality of it and the effect on people's lives, but the the political policies that have been brought about by it, lockdowns and so on. This has created yet another source of debate. I mean, looking at this country, we've had a lot of contentious issues in recent years. We had the Scottish referendum, we had Brexit, which, surprise, surprise, was a very, very divisive issue. And unfortunately, some people still fall into this trap of Remainers versus Leavers. It's one thing I liked what Kimmy Badenoch said during one of the debates, the ITV debate. She said we need to move on from pitching people as Remainers versus Leavers or something to that effect. I find that very refreshing because I think the Tories are a bit obsessed by Brexit. Um, so yeah, those divisive referendums I think cause cynicism because if you're on the losing side, you're going to feel angry and disappointed. And even if you're on the winning side, you're going to feel the other side doesn't accept democracy. So it's I don't like referendums. I just think they're naturally divisive. Um, Politics, in this country, there is a huge breakdown in trust. I think certainly the sleaze of the Johnson administration. But generally, I think in modern times, not just in this country, probably all over the world, you can see this in France, the United States, certainly all over the democratic world, there is limited major enthusiasm for politicians and governments. Germany might be slightly, Merkel always enjoyed a relative, she was never deeply unpopular, but certainly in France, the UK, and the United States, there has been, it doesn't matter which party is in power, there's this consistent cynicism. Oh, they're all in it for themselves, they're all the same. Now, I don't think that's true. I think there are decent people motivated for the right reasons involved in politics. I do think where there is power, there is, I don't want to say where there's power, there's corruption, but where there is power, there is the tools of corruption. There's egos, there's narcissism. Narcissism might be a strong word, but what I'm driving at is the recipes are there. Um, but people have this idea that it's a modern thing. Like, take for example the American situation. People have this idea that take John F. Kennedy for example. Before that time, politics was all nice and passive, and it was all clean. JFK would have had a rough time in social media. I mean, he swore like a sailor. He was a womanizer. But the whole Camelot myth came about because he was murdered at a young age. But it's the same with Churchill in this country. I mean, people have this aura around Churchill, and forget he was a human being. I mean, he was cantankerous. He um, he was certainly very politically incorrect by today's standards. In fact, some of his views were basically racist. But that doesn't mean we can't admire what he done for this country. And I just think people are making a mistake if they think it's somehow this generation of politicians is necessarily different. I think politics has always, 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 always had a murky side to it or a cynical side to it. But I also believe it's always had a noble side. And I think, being involved in journalism, I read newspapers extensively. And I think that if you have a political scandal, it's valid to report it. I think it's important to something like Partygate, where double standards are involved. But the truth is that sells more than, for example, a successful policy. And even newspapers that might be in favor of a government, um, scandal sells more than success, unfortunately. So if you have a particularly successful policy, that's going to get like maybe page 10. If there's some scandal, that'll get page 1, the front cover even. And I think that's sad. So I do think the media is partly answerable to the depths of cynicism that people feel. And this is not to say that shouldn't report it. I'm a fierce believer in press freedom, but I do think, and I think even some top journalists will admit this, there is this tendency to look at the negative more than the positive. Um, I think that needs to be addressed. This constant, relentless, tearing people down, like they must always be in it for the wrong reasons, instead of saying, well, actually, this is good policy, and reporting that and saying this has been successful. Um, I just think there should be a bit more balance. Um, I think the culture wars have definitely played a role. I mean, I think they're toxic. I really do. Um, we've seen it in the US, but I think a lot of it spilled over here. And this is not to say that Britain and America are twins. There are issues that go on in the States. For example, the gun issue. and the abortion issue that are a lot more vociferous over there, especially the gun issue. Um, thank goodness that's not an issue in this country, um, or barely an issue. That's a good thing because it's toxic, and people have strong views, um, and they get worked up about things, understandably, especially when lives are involved. But it's just this entrenchment on this, this absence of meeting the other side halfway. And I know that's difficult when you get zealotry and you get political extremes. I think it's very hard to reason with that. But I've said that American moderates need to let their voice be known as well. I saw Beto O'Rourke's campaign for governor of Texas. Now he's a left-wing politician, but to be fair to him, he's listened to conservatives. There was a guy in one of his rallies who was very pro-guns and was cynical of O'Rourke's position, but they had a civil conversation. So more of that is good. But I think when you get figures like Donald Trump and you get left wing equivalents who are firebrands, they're demagogues. They certainly don't help. Then we get into this murky, dark world of conspiracy theories. Now, my position on this, I'm trying to cover everything before I watch the announcement. My position on this is not we should just blindly believe everything mainstream media says. That's not what I'm saying. I think it's healthy to question power. I think it's healthy to think independently. But my big issue with conspiracy theories and theorists is that they won't scrutinize their own sources. So they'll say, I'm enlightened. And I know on my last live stream, a guy came on and was, you know, saying, you guys need to think for yourselves. Well, if he happened to be watching this, I say to him and I say to other conspiracy theorists, what about your own sources? Are you scrutinizing those things? Saying, well, this is the gospel proof. How do you know? How do you know the source you're looking at isn't flawed? Um, so I think that when you get this, I think the whole world of conspiracy theories, it's interesting. It can actually be interesting. I mean, from a journalistic point of view, I think it's interesting how people think about these things, but I think they can also be very dangerous. We've seen that with QAnon and other such extreme ideologies, really. Um, and I think there's another thing that we have to be honest about. It's icon worship. Now, this can be in the form of celebrities. I recently watched Baz Luhrmann's Elvis. I'm going to make a video about that because I'm a big Elvis Presley fan, but it's a useful case study. Um, you get people who worship the king, Elvis Presley. They forget that he was a man and he had flaws. This can also be said of people like Princess Diana, Muhammad Ali, John Lennon, um, and there's a handful of other figures, not very many, but it's this icon worship. I think it's very unhealthy because people then put their icon on this pedestal, Michael Jackson to some extent, on this pedestal, whereby anyone who dares criticize them it's almost like a religious fervor. I think it's very unhealthy. So I think that elevating any human being to that sort of status. Recently, we celebrated the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. Now, I'm a royalist. I happen to think it's good for this country, but I don't think the Queen is perfect. I don't think she's a deity. I think she's been an exemplary constitutional monarch. I think we can be proud of her in many ways. But she hasn't always got it right. And I can say that because I'm in a free country. I'm not going to be charged with lèse majesté for saying that, thank goodness. Um, so I think putting human beings on this pedestal, we have to remember everyone, all these pop culture heroes, they all have their flaws. Muhammad Ali believed in segregation. John Lennon, while speaking about his love for women, had a pretty shady record when it came to the treatment of his wives. His Cynthia Lennon, for example. Um, Elvis, his final years were not exactly noble. There's a lot of areas to look at, and every single human being is flawed. I'm flawed. I know there are things I need to work on. So I think instead of elevating icons to this level, we need to accept that all human beings, are flawed. Um, I'll close with an optimistic note. All these things are true. And it's easy to sink into despair. COVID, rising living costs, antisocial behavior, the culture wars, the rise of China, threat to Western liberal democracies, Russia's barbaric actions in Ukraine. If, like me, you think about all these things, it can get very depressing. But the world's a big place, and there's also a lot of good out there. The other day, I saw an uplifting video. This elephant had kind of got trapped in, I guess it was some sort of manhole or trench in Thailand, and people, park rangers and others, they were just pulling together as a team, and they got this mother elephant out, and its little calf came, and it was a happy ending. It was a success story. As I've pointed out recently, conservation can be very successful. Sometimes you get green groups that are very dystopian and alarmist, but it isn't all a bad picture. Um, there are successful conservation efforts going on. There's clearly huge challenges in the world, but I think it's a mistake to look at everything as constantly negative. There is a lot of good out there. There's a lot of good people. There's a lot of good people. I read about two teenage girls yesterday. They saved two young boys from drowning. So, they were putting their lives at risk to do the right thing. I think they should get some sort of recognition. There's selfless, brave, decent people out there. Lots of them, actually. It's not just outliers, there's a lot of them. I think probably most people are fundamentally decent. Um, so I want to close on that optimistic note. It's not all bad. And I think it's a mistake to maybe things are going wrong in your life, and then you look at the news and it can be very depressing. My life is not exactly smooth right now, but I always think it's never all bad. If you just look, there's a lot of good out there. There really is, and that's something to, consider. Really. So I don't think 2022, if we're really objective about it, has to be like this cynical, terrible time. It doesn't have to be. There's a lot of potential for good out there. I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.